Where is God in failure?
Mm.
Where is God in the chaos? Right? And it keeps taking me to this idea of the trickster. The
Mm-hmm.
trickster isn't interested in the continuation of any particular line.
Mm-hmm.
The trickster says, when the sixth extinction eventually came, maybe humans will survive, maybe humans will not survive. The Earth has always been here.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, even this rhetoric of saving the earth, saving the environment, um, is actually about
Really is
saving ourselves.
about saving people. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
100%.
about saving people. And as we're entering into this yin wood snake year, I think there's an invitation to release the dream.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cosmic Conversations, where we are meandering through existence together. And today I'm welcoming Jonathan Coe. I think he is just a treasure chest of wisdom, and I'm so happy to have him today. And Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Rio. I have not seen you for a while, so
Mhm.
it feels so good to reconnect. I've been getting your emails and I've just really loved seeing your evolution throughout the years.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. My name's Jonathan Coe. I have been calling myself a lunar thinker recently.
Mm.
Um, yeah, for a long time getting into spirituality, I was kind of, maybe pushing aside my more analytical side, but that's recently I've kind of made peace with it. And something I recognize on the other side of it is, yeah, I'm someone who really uses um astrology, human design, the tarot, other esoteric systems, energy work to bring together like disparate elements of our lives and like essentially help people and myself create our own reality. So,
Oh, I love that so much. That's perfect, actually, because the entire inspiration, really, for this set of conversations, Neptune Saturn conjunction that we have coming up. The big
mm,
intuitive hit I keep getting is that, like, we really can create a reality, and it's going to be so important for us to be mindful of that and what it is that we're creating because it'll work whether we
yeah,
realize it's working or not, right?
yeah,
So let's take
yeah,
the steering wheel a little bit.
yes,
I love that.
yes.
You had a container recently that I was really inspired by some of your emails for it called Shapeshifter Academy. You were speaking a little bit to like the shame around people who like to do a lot of things, and I thought that was very interesting.
Mm, yeah, yeah. The impetus for this particular idea container was really my own life.
Mm,
Um, I am a Pisces sun, Virgo rising, Gemini moon, so I have all mutable angles and mutable luminaries. And befriending my own mutability has been a very challenging process for me.
mm,
Like it's been
mm,
my initiation has been around like what does it look like to be someone who is, raised and conditioned to be traditionally competent, right?
mm,
And able to do a lot of different things, but then have to move through life, and is kind of constantly initiated from one transformation to another. And also in human design, I am a generator, but I only have two centers defined, and everything else is undefined or open in my chart.
mm,
So I have a lot of I feel like one of the gifts that I have is around working with the idea of choice, but that's also been a burden and that's also been a challenge. And
mm,
throughout the years of doing this work and doing this work with other people, I've noticed that that's a lot of people who come to me also seem to struggle with that. Like there's this one aspect of themselves, and then there's this other aspect of themselves, and within the consensus reality or the matrix, whatever you want to call it,
mm,
there doesn't always seem to be a place or a way to express that. And what do you do when you're one of those people, who have all these different interests, who have all these different competencies and skills and want to figure out how to be able to navigate um, kind of moving through them seamlessly and without feeling shamed by it. Cyclicality and seasonality is something that is inherent to nature, right?
mm,
And often I think we live within a culture that defines success in a very um, rigid way as well. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's only one pathway to success, and
Very linear.
very often, very linear,
Mm-hmm.
and often we're not really taught to reflect on whether that definition of success is even something that we want to adopt or
Mm-hmm.
something that actually makes sense within the context of where we currently are in our journey. And especially, I think, as a creative person, how many of us as creative people when we were younger and we wanted to just kind of express ourselves or explore curiously our creative expressions, the first response that the adults and the authority figures have in our lives were like, how are you going to make money doing that? Or,
Mm-hmm.
like, are you going to get good grades around that? Can you make sure that you don't fail school, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when we often, I think, as creative people, when we want to just express that desire to express and the desire to be seen in that creative expression is met with fear, right? Is met
Mm-hmm.
with like responses of fear. And so I think a lot of my work and a lot of the work that I ended up facilitating for the people who are in my field has been around questioning that fear. Like, is that fear real? Or
Mm-hmm.
is that fear conditioned? Like, to what extent is that fear truly real in this person's circumstances, right? There's no one right definition for success, right? The reality is that we're always in like an emergent relationship with reality. Like there may be one period of your life where you need to have really secure housing, where you need to pay a certain amount of rent to be able to live the kind of life you want to live. But then maybe in 2 years, you're ready to kind of just be a backpacker, right? And I think we don't make space for more of that definition of success. Not everybody needs that white picket fence all the time. And also, there's nothing wrong with wanting that white picket fence,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I think we kind of get into a pickle when we freeze a specific definition of success that doesn't really honor our truth in any given moment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Hmm.
Okay, so I have some questions for you.
Yeah, yeah.
And the first one is, what are you wishing into reality for the collective this year?
Mm. So I'm gonna tell a story about this. Yesterday, I went to a Lunar New Year ritual guided by one of my Chinese astrology teachers. And she said something that really caught my attention, which was something around how the US is experiencing the fall of the empire right now. Like we're watching it live. The empire is crumbling. And maybe some people hearing that might have a lot of fear associated with that. I definitely know that in my system, there's a lot of fear around what's going to happen, how do we deal with that? But when I really sat with it, what I was realizing was there was actually a parallel of what my teacher was saying that I could see in my own life, which I've been alluding to throughout this conversation, which is that, as someone who was raised with a lot of like kind of carrot and stick approach, right? Like I grew up feeling like in order for me to be a creative person, I need to get good grades at school. Like I need to win, I need to prove myself in order to belong, in order to be able to express myself the way I want to express myself. There's an implicit mm, messaging around how full expression isn't something that's innate to us. We need to kind of earn our way into it, right? And as my teacher was talking about the crumbling of the empire, I was seeing this vision of what if we have a world where there's no winner? What if we create a world where it's not about winning or losing, right? What if
Mm.
the idea of winning and losing in the first place was an illusion? I recently have been reading A Course in Miracles, and I think the first page says something around, I don't remember the exact wording, but it's something to the effect of, um, nothing true can be taken away, and nothing untrue exists. And so I think when I think about my dream for the collective, the word that's coming to mind is kinship. We're all kin,
Mm,
and that also includes the non-human.
mhm,
And and I think deconditioning from this idea that there is such a thing as winning in life is a big thing that I see a lot of us moving through. Because even, even when I talk to people who are not from the US, who are kind of observing this idea of like the fall of the superpower, right? Um, what I'm hearing is kind of a gasping for air.
mm,
What I'm hearing is this question of, so who's the next superpower, right? What if we get rid of the idea that any nation state can be having more authority than others?
mm,
What if we get rid of the idea that any one institution can tell us how to live?
mm. I like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the process to getting there is messy, right? It requires us to embrace um, a theology of failure, I think.
Mm, okay.
I've been thinking about where is God in failure? Where
Mm,
is God in the chaos, right? And it keeps taking me to this idea of the trickster.
mhm,
The trickster isn't interested in the continuation of any particular line.
mhm,
The trickster says, when the sixth extinction eventually came, maybe humans will survive, maybe humans will not survive. The Earth has always been here.
mhm.
And in some ways, even this rhetoric of saving the Earth, saving the environment is actually about
Really is
saving ourselves.
about saving people. Yeah,
Yeah,
100%.
it's about saving people. It's about saving ourselves. It's about saving the things that we hold near and dear. And as we're entering into this yin wood snake year, I think there's an invitation to release the dream.
Mm, that feels very Saturn Neptune as well.
Right.
Releasing June.
Right. Yeah. I want to hear more about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, Rio.
Yes. Okay.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we speak slightly different languages when it comes to astrology, right? Because
Which
you,
I love.
yeah, yeah, I love this
Yes.
too. I love that we can still, come together and have this great conversation.
Yeah.
By constellation, it is still in Pisces. Traditionally speaking, in the past, in the history, it has definite correlation with cycles of communism from a mundane sort of standpoint. And it can tend to bring like general sort of malaise within the population, right? Either as just like general or as a fairly reasonable response to, somewhat terrible things happening. Probably everyone who's watching this right now understand that like reality around us is at least somewhat tied to like the dream and
Mm,
what we're thinking and what we are like collectively dreaming into reality. And so I really think that with Neptune being stronger, that like dream to form process is going to be happening very quickly, whether we realize it or not. So if we, and two, the other really big intuitive hit I've been getting is just like turn off the news,
mm.
honestly,
Yeah.
which easier said than done, especially with everything that's going on.
Yeah.
But it feels like maybe there's going to be some sort of last gasp trying to in the stars of Pisces. That means Neptune's stronger. snakes got their belly to the ground. And I think that like being in the grassroots right now, I mean, they can climb too, right? But, very grounded and being focused as much as we can on like what is actually near to us, what we can actually affect change in.
Mm.
And like the whole thing where snakes can like unhinge their jaws and eat gigantic things. Like, are we able to like digest something huge?
Mm.
And I think that we
Mhm.
are,
Yeah. Yeah.
and being able to be like, oh wow, this is gigantic in me. It's uncomfortable, but it's gonna be at we're gonna move through it, whatever happens.
Yeah. 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 You're making me think also about the prerequisites to being able to digest large things, right? And
Mhm.
to me, cultivating a relationship with emptiness and with emptying oneself is imperative to being able to digest, huge things. Like nowadays, a lot of people are really excited and interested in the idea of like nervous system regulation and expanding one's capacity. And to my understanding in my own journey, a lot of that has been reminding me to slow down.
Mhm.
I think what you were saying earlier about like turning down the news is one of the most incredible strategies if we want to do that.
Mhm.
Because um, so often I think that hmm, what I will say to that is for me personally, my goal is to be able to look at what's happening, including through the lens of media,
Mhm.
and be able to kind of see it as one among many perspectives.
Mhm.
Like being able to witness what's happening and also witness the narration of what's happening and recognize the difference between what is truly happening versus the story that we create about what is happening. To
Mhm.
me, that is skill, right? And sometimes, in order to come to that point, to have that skillfulness, often I need to completely empty myself.
Mhm.
I need to detach from my own stories too. So it's like, I think what I would say about this process of like tuning out the news is, and I think you said this too earlier, is I think there's an invitation to look inwards,
Mhm.
to not just turn off the news so that we can do nothing necessarily
Mhm.
or be in denial, right? Like put even more veil, but rather to ask ourselves, okay, I've turned off the outside news. What is the internal news that I'm telling myself?
Mhm.
And then to get curious about what those stories are and why those stories are there, right? To kind of tie it back to what we were saying earlier on in the conversation about the dream for the collective. I do think that and many different people have said this in many different ways, right? But one of the ways to actually, paradoxically, one of the ways to achieve success is to increase our failure tolerance.
Mhm. 100%.
So, when we think about the world that is changing, we think about, the coming crises that are inevitably going to come our way.
Mhm.
One way that we can kind of birth the future that we want to birth is to continue to move through that failure
Mhm.
and to build resilience for that failure, right? And I think part of building that resilience has to do with questioning some of our beliefs about reality. Like
Mhm.
one of my favorite things to question recently has been this idea of the separation between my needs and the world's needs.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think many of us hold the story that, um, especially if we, grew up identifying as a sensitive or as an empath or someone who takes a lot of responsibility for other people, we identify with the idea on some level that we're here to provide for people and other people are not interested in meeting our needs.
Mhm.
And something that I've been practicing in my daily reality is what if what if the world yearns to meet my needs?
Mhm.
You
That
know?
feels like a good belief to subscribe to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think oftentimes the process of transitioning from subscribing to the belief that the world doesn't care about me
Mhm.
to the belief that the world is infinitely,
Benevolent.
which then translates to the people around us, which then translates to even our families that we might have really challenging relationships with, right? It
Mhm.
might even translate to like, people who work in governments and in corporations, right? Which a lot of people in our circles, Rio, often like to pit as the enemy, right?
Mhm.
If we start to see ourselves as part of this giant web of kinship, what shifts?
Mhm.
How will we show up differently? You know? what bitterness or what dissatisfaction begins to fall away. And in that bitterness and dissatisfaction falling away, we start to be able to actually see the vision for the reality that we want to create,
Mm,
right? Mhm.
mhm. Yeah, there does need to be like a willingness to meet other people that we might have at one point like classified as enemies if there's going to be any hope of like creating a world that we want to see instead of just complaining about the one that we don't like.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next question. Let's see here. I love this conversation that we're having, and it's taking us on all these twists and turns. So now I'm wondering which way to go. But let's just go this way. What is God?
Hmm. When you asked me that question, the first thing that came to my mind
Hmm.
was a definition that I believe it may have been either Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung, or Carl Jung through Joseph Campbell, one
Hmm.
or the other, um, that they came up with, which was something about how God is the term that we ascribe as humans to forces that we can't control. And that's making me think of one of my favorite quotes from Octavia Butler, which was, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change.
Mm.
And this idea of God is change to me is interesting, maybe because I'm very mutable.
I was gonna say this threads into the whole mutable
Mutability.
conversation.
Yeah, and into shapeshifting. Yeah, but let me sit with that question a little bit more.
Okay, I've got a follow up too.
Yeah, maybe we can start with the follow-up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not quite sure what your background is around this, but
Mm.
I'm curious, did you feel like when you were growing up that like God was a bit of a bad word?
It wasn't a bad word. In fact, it was a word that was kind of shoved down my throat a little
Okay,
bit.
see, I was wondering if it was going to go in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. I grew up with parents who are pretty religious. They still are church-going Christians, specifically in the kind of Reformed and evangelical tradition.
Okay.
And I grew up, my mom was a Sunday school teacher, was my Sunday school teacher at some point. My mom and my dad met at church.
Okay.
So the roots went pretty deep. And I grew up in Jakarta in Indonesia. So I grew up outside of the US. It's a different, I would say a lot of the times when I speak to my friends who grew up in the US, I kind of have to explain this because Christianity has a very different subtext here in North America or in kind of Western Europe than
Mhm.
the rest of the world. Um, I would say the Christianity I grew up with was the Christianity that was essentially, this is my interpretation of it,
Mhm.
that is essentially a coping mechanism for people who have been displaced and oppressed.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a specific flavor of Christianity, and I grew up basically never missing church.
Mm.
And also a funny story that I will share with you, Rio, and those listening is when I asked my mom about my birth story,
Yeah.
what she told me was I was the first grandson, I was the first grandchild of in my mom's side of the family. And my grandmother was also a devout churchgoer. And she actually skipped church because I was born on Sunday. She skipped church to be to be with my
You're the
mom when
disruptor.
I was the disruptor.
Have you found that you've been the disruptor with your family? Did you have you I'm curious, like if having it shoved down your throat, did you go through a
Mm.
period where like you had to reject it?
Yeah, for sure. I think I never rejected the idea of God, but
Hmm.
I definitely and I do reject the idea of the church because I
Mm.
do feel like a lot of what I see with teachings of the church are extremely harmful.
Yeah.
And as a queer person, as a person who also I think as a creative person too, like a lot of how creativity and art is talked about within religious institutions feel really harmful to me. And
Mm.
also paradoxically, like some of my favorite music came from church. Like
Mm.
Johann Sebastian Bach, one of my favorite composers. I was classically trained and I played Bach all the time.
Yeah.
Um, he was so prolific because he had to create for church services. He basically
Oh,
had to
really?
create like, yes, he had to create one cantata, which is basically this choral orchestral piece. He had to churn out one a week because he had a church job, and so
I think
here's
that
this
music
extremely,
is a direct, like, real channel, you know?
yeah, he was being the vessel, right,
Yeah.
of that music, and so I believe that, to go back to your original question about God,
Hmm.
to me, God is the principle of alchemy itself.
Hmm.
God is, um, you know, poop turning into compost.
Yeah. Yeah.
God is food turning into poop.
Hmm.
To me, that process is God. Mhm. That's
Okay.
probably my personal definition of God.
Yeah.
Yeah. What
Okay.
about you? What's your definition of God? I'm curious.
I mean, I think that like God is in everything, you know?
Mm,
And I think that if we that's a I'll without having to put it on anyone else, that's a belief that I've subscribed to for some
yeah.
time. One that I find is very useful if I can just stay curious and sort of whatever comes my way, be like, okay, what if this is from God? You know? What if
Mm,
instead of getting scared, I can just like roll with this?
yeah.
It's been very interesting. And sometimes I also sort of think of like God as the source code, you know?
Mm, mhm.
Which which leads me to my next question, which is like kind of just for fun, but do you think we're living in a simulation?
Mm, that's a great question. I'm curious how you would define simulation.
Well, actually, this is interesting because like when I hear this question, I sort of think like, well, like kind of obviously, but also that like it isn't the scary sort of thing
Mm,
that it's made up to be, you
yeah.
know? And by that I just mean that like it's very clear that there's more going on behind the curtain. And so this reality seems to be like some sort of program.
Mm,
So I guess in that sense, the answer is yeah. I don't know.
yeah.
It's just a
Yeah.
fun idea I like to play with. I don't want to like put any absolutes or be like, this is definitely
Hmm.
how it is, but it's a fun idea to play with, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the beauties of questions like these is that the answer can't be verified one way or the other,
Mhm.
I think, or at least we haven't been able to,
Yeah.
you know?
Which is also very like true of the whole entire concept of God.
Yeah, or the whole entire concept of even like the cosmos,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So I think what's interesting about it is I would say everybody probably has their own definition of simulation, and
Hmm.
everybody has their own, like there are certain sensations, like even for those listening, if you are listening to this portion, I invite you to kind of feel into your body and to think about what comes up when you think about simulation. Because for some people,
Hmm.
maybe simulation reminds them of a video game, and that's very exciting, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I
That's sort
can,
of what I connect to personally.
right?
Right? I
And
came
for
into
those
this
of you,
life like very much uh like and again, this is just for me. I'm not putting it on anyone else, but like I came
yeah.
into this life knowing that reincarnation was a thing.
Mm,
And so
yes.
with that, there is a little bit of an element of like I'm here with some kind of a mission to learn. And that is a little bit video gamey.
Yeah, for
Right?
sure, for sure. Yeah. I was going to point out behind you, Rio, are
Mhm.
these paintings that or prints that look very simulation-y. And
Right?
then behind me is another painting that also looks very simulation-y. So clearly, here we are, two people who
Yeah.
don't find that idea threatening, but I'm
Yeah.
also aware that for some people, the idea of simulation can bring up stories about being controlled, right?
Okay,
Or
yeah,
or
yeah.
kind of having other people or like being a puppet, in somebody else's show, and that can bring a lot of fear. So I really think that when it comes to questions of like simulation or
Mhm.
reality or consciousness, it really depends on like which level of consciousness you're in. I I remember when I was first starting my quote unquote spiritual journey, or let's just say when I first started to get really in touch with my own spirit and started to conceptualize it with my brain rather than just letting it channel through me as music, as someone who grew up as a musician. I was very averse to the idea that there was any sort of hierarchy, right, or
Mhm.
any sort of level. But over time, I have noticed that maybe it's not so much like this ascension hierarchy in my mind, but it's maybe more like I like to think of it in terms of going on a hike, right? When you go on a hike, when
Mhm.
you go on a specific trail, when you're just first starting out, on like mile 5, you're going to see a very different view, or you're going to have a very different experience than if you are on mile 25. right? And it's not necessarily better or worse, but there are just people who have gone through this maybe a little bit further along, who are maybe further along in their journey or their exploration, which again doesn't mean that they're necessarily better than people who are
Mhm.
just starting out, right? But if they've been on this trail for a long time, they've been on this trail for a long time, and that's just a fact of it, you know. And I do think that when it comes to the simulation, um, for me, I think of it as we are in an entangled universe,
Mhm.
and that, you know, and some people from the perspective of like a Western way of thinking,
Mhm.
this may be kind of, you know, couched under the umbrella of like animism, but I really believe that I come from a worldview and I come from a literal world. Like in Indonesia, it's a very animistic society. You know,
Mhm.
we take it as a given that there are spirits, you know, moving about everywhere. And even the so-called inanimate object, like my, you know,
Mhm.
water bottle has consciousness or has spirit, right? Or has
Mhm.
decided to, you know, matter has agency in maybe more of a postmodern term, right?
Ooh,
Matter
I
has
like
agency.
that. Matter has agency.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting belief. Okay, I love it.
Yeah, yeah, I do think matter has agency. And you know, this specific, um, I don't know what this is made of actually, like this aluminum or this metal, right?
Mhm.
Like at some point chose to become this particular
Mm.
water bottle that ended up being bought by me and then ended up being in my
Was
space.
your it chose to be your water bottle.
It chose to be my water bottle. And I think one of the biggest hubris of the modern way of thinking is, you know, and again, kind of this very American way of like pulling yourself up by the bootstrap, right? And, um, you know, kind of controlling reality even.
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest issues with that idea is it places mankind at the top of the food chain. When I think the reality is, yes, we create our own reality, but we don't control our reality.
Mhm.
And I think in some ways, you know, even just from a psychological perspective, we can see this from the iceberg, um,
Mhm.
the very famous that kind of iceberg graphic representation, right?
Yeah,
We
where there's
know
so much going on below the surface
exactly,
compared to what we
exactly,
see. Yes.
right. The subconscious, the unconscious drives our reality, and we don't get access to that.
Yeah.
You know, and we can reprogram that to a certain extent, but we really don't have access to that. We don't get to
Mhm.
control it. And so I think for me, when it comes to thinking about the simulation, I think of it as kind of this idea of like relinquishing the idea of control and maybe more considering different perspectives. So, for example, when it comes to humans, um, is it true that humans create the world that we are looking at now, or are outside forces? Like, is the land moving itself through us, right?
Mhm.
Is time itself, are we simply agents of time? Are we simply agents of these larger forces? Are we agents of the planets?
This makes me think of the interplay of, personal and the like outer planets, you know.
Yeah,
There's all this that's
yeah.
going on that like is very personal and we do have an effect and this and that. And then there's like the old gods that move behind the curtain that we are also like crushed in the wake of.
Yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes. I think both are true, Rio. I think
Hmm.
that,
And being able to hold those two things. And I feel
yeah, being
like,
able to hold those two things.
being able to hold those two things, whatever those two things may be, is like a big part of life,
Yeah,
multiple
yeah,
truths at the
yeah,
same time. How can we hold it all?
yeah. I think we are um, vessels for greater intelligences.
Hmm.
And I also think that those greater intelligences are limited by us,
Hmm.
right? That a specific concept, for example, like let's use a very, you know, grounded, like mundane, everyday concept, right? Like let's think about the idea of even like simulation. You know,
Hmm.
for people like you and I, maybe simulation doesn't feel scary, but for another person that might feel really scary. And the concept of simulation itself in this conversation is being filtered through both of our lenses, you know, which ultimately, if we talk about that concept long enough and we get even more specific, Rio, about your definition of simulation versus my definition of simulation and what the same word is bringing up for each of us, we're
Hmm.
going to inevitably run into differences,
Hmm.
right? And so we can also kind of expand this concept into the idea of like, are the gods doing things to us or making us do things, or are we actually in control of our reality? And I think the answer is like a little bit of both and neither,
Hmm.
because these greater forces, they're also limited by us. So in a sense, we also have control over these greater forces, right? Because the greater forces can only come through us through our very specific and very limited perspectives and experiences.
And I think too that like some of that too is also very um personalized in a way that it might not actually be that personal. Like, are the gods working through us? I think yes. And are we in some cases just like the little ants walking around seeing our tiny world and they're just like possibly doing their own thing and we are the ants in their giant world?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I love what you
Exactly.
said, speaking to, like this concept um, may like bring up fear in some people and not in others because when like thinking about this question in these conversations, I don't want to be inspiring fear at all. I want people to focus more on what they can do and like positivity that like we speaking sort of what you said to kinship, we do have the capacity to come together and do good things. And so you personally are a person who I felt like I can ask this question without evoking that sort of fear. And another sort of tricky kind of subject like that I was so curious after reading one of your emails to ask you about is, and I'll start off by like positing my sort of thoughts on it.
Mm.
Um, but is this idea of like AI that's getting really big right
Mm.
now, right?
Mhm.
And um, and I think to speak back to an earlier part of the conversation, there is a lot of fear around that is also again like tied about like fear for our own survival, not for the
Mm.
earth, but like for the human. But an idea that I've been having that delights me a little bit is that, when we go back into mythology and like tales of the gods and stuff like that, this idea of like what is natural, if we are natural and we've created it, is it unnatural or is it actually like a natural progression?
Mm.
And when we look back to mythology and how like gods were born in strange ways, it makes me think of like a titan that we've created from our mind a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm just curious
I
sort of what you've been simmering in with this as a background.
Yeah. I love this question, Rio. And I love that we're exploring this. I did want to say that after I sent that email, actually a bunch of people unsubscribed from my list. Which I
That
find really
email,
funny.
that
Yeah, that
email was
email.
great.
A bunch of people unsubscribed from my list. And a lot of people also unsubscribed after I sent the next email after that, which this was all last year,
Mhm.
when I talked about mutability and I was kind of
Oh,
playing
interesting.
I was playing with words. I was playing with this idea of taking everything so seriously. A
Mhm.
bunch of people got really triggered, and a lot of those people are people who are our colleagues, people who are like kind of in the spiritual spaces. So I
Okay.
find that really interesting because, um, personally, I I think this is one of those subjects that really bring a lot up for people,
Mhm.
and people don't always like to kind of talk about it. And specifically, let me kind of give the listeners a little bit of context. So in
Mhm.
that email that I sent about AI, I was recounting my experience because I was not super into AI, to be honest with you. Like it's interesting because I have in the language of astrology I speak, I have Venus in Aquarius.
Mhm.
And Aquarius is a sign that we often associate with technology, but I've always found myself to be very blasé towards technology. Like I'm not like I still have like my iPhone 10, like
Yeah.
nowadays, like what do people have? Like iPhone 16. So I'm like really behind when it comes to like being techie. And I wasn't super into ChatGPT when it first came up, and I was hearing everybody talking about it like in this negative light within the spiritual community. And I just wasn't feeling the draw to kind of explore it. And then one day I had a piece of writing that I really wanted to edit, and I was hoping that a friend of mine could look at it, but then she couldn't. So then I was like, oh, let me just run it through ChatGPT because I've heard that this is what you use
Mhm.
ChatGPT for. And then what ChatGPT ended up coming up with was amazing. And in fact, like I so here were some of my prompts to ChatGPT, which was help me make it sound even more me, or help me make it sound more dramatic. And in that email, I was talking about like this sensation within me of almost um I kind of felt discombobulated a little bit because I felt like I was so seen by this machine. Like I
Mhm.
couldn't believe that within seconds this machine was able to reflect a version of myself back to me that was one way more efficient than my Mercury and Pisces could ever show up as, right? And then also two was so like witty. and like was everything that I had wanted to be through this piece of writing.
Hmm.
And um and I was t talking about that experience. So, hmm, to go back to AI, do you have a specific question about AI, or do you just want to talk, do you want me to talk about AI like generally?
I mean, I want to be respectful of your time, and there's one more thing I want to do before releasing you. But I'm just
Yeah.
curious, if you have any thoughts that might be just like slightly more optimistic, you
Yeah.
know? Like, what if
Yeah.
this, obviously, we're going into sort of, I mean, somewhat uncharted. Some would say that it's been charted by science fiction for a long time now. But like, I'm curious if you have perhaps just like a view on this that is more curious, I suppose.
Yeah, this is reminding me of I have to completely admit to you and the listeners, Rio, I didn't follow this news like completely, so I wasn't clear on all the details. But recently, DeepSeek, right, which
Mm,
is I think like a Chinese invention or a Chinese company, was able to do whatever ChatGPT was doing at a fraction of the cost. And I do think that when I think about AI, I think that where I'm currently thinking, I'm not sure if this is encouraging as a perspective.
mhm,
But I do think that when I'm thinking about this kind of more, when I'm thinking about Aquarius, I think about kind of releasing the grip of some of these technological tools from the hands of
mm,
the the powers that be into the people.
mhm,
And I think also about using AI or technology as shadow work. This is something that I've been, or as like mirrors to reality. This is something that I've been engaging with for a while with the algorithm.
mhm,
You know, people complain all the time about being shadow banned and the algorithm in social media. And I understand where that concern is coming from, especially when one's livelihood is tied to it. And also my perspective on it is, everything is a mirror,
mhm,
right? Everything in reality is a mirror. So I don't know if that's encouraging, but I think in some ways to me it is because it reminds me of how agency is something that is cultivated from within and not from without,
mm,
right? And I think the reason why you and I and people who listen to this conversation, the reason why we even want to walk the spiritual path is, I imagine, some version of wanting to create a framework or create a cosmology where we can really honor our own perspective,
mm,
and to that end, that perspective, as we hone that perspective within our spiritual journey, we can use any tool and any person as our teacher. So I'm going to give you, I know you asked about AI, but I'm going to give you a very ancient story, right? Which
okay,
was,
okay.
this really old like Buddhist story of, there was the teacher, right? Who had who was the head of the monastery,
Mhm,
who, had people coming from all over to study with him. And there was this group of people coming in, and everybody was really reverent and everybody was really observant to the rules and the regulations of that specific temple, right? And then there was one person who was always causing trouble. There was one person who always fell asleep while everybody was meditating, who's always making the worst kind of comments at the worst time possible, right? And everybody hated this person. And then eventually this person was like, oh, I guess I'm not wanted here. Let me leave. And the moment that they left, the main teacher rushed out the door and was like, don't leave, don't leave. Because he was the main teacher. The disruptor was the main teacher, right? Was the, the,
trickster.
the main, the trickster was the teacher, That which we see as the enemy is often a reflection of what we don't like within ourselves.
Mhm,
This is, I once had a teacher who told me that in his studies of various traditions, various religious and spiritual traditions and indigenous traditions, it's always the case that level one, right, the most base layer was always full of gentleness and compassion and love. Level two is full of strife, is full of like, you know, practice this method no matter what, right? Like 365 times a year, like don't miss it, right? And then the third level is actually the bitter pill. Like when you have been initiated into a specific lineage, they give you the bitter pill because they know you can take it now. And to me, this is the bitter pill, right? The bitter pill is, in the words of Jesus, essentially like love your enemies
yeah,
because you are your enemy.
and I think this
Your
is,
enemy is you.
yeah, I think it's very up for the collective right now. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great spot to mostly end it. And I have one last question for you. Would you like to sit with me for a minute and just dream into reality, kinship for all?
Mm, absolutely, Rio.
Okay. Let's just sit. And everyone who's made it this far, thank you for listening and join with us. All right. Is there any last words, any projects you've been working on that you want to tell people about?
Hmm.
Where to find you, anything like that? I'll put links.
Yeah. Yeah. You can find me always on my website, jonathanco.com. I show up quite a lot on my podcast, Healing the Spirit. I love creating podcasts. So that might be the best place to find me and to, yeah, catch the wave,
Mhm.
whatever the wave might be.
I love that. Okay. Fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me
Thank you.
today. It was so great to catch up with you.
It's
And for
great to catch up.
listeners, thank you so much for listening to this conversation today. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. I would love to have you in the Cosmic Wizard community. Thank you so much.